an agricultural scam of the largest proportions maybe in American history. And it was based around what I'll be selling after the talk tonight, Jerusalem artichokes. Just give me a call and I'll deliver a truckload of tubers to your backyard. The other is more penetrating and riveting and psychologically disconcerting. This is back in 1983 when the artichoke fiasco, which was very short, blew up like an asteroid, but a small asteroid. But the other was like being hit by a meteor, and that was a father and son killed 2 bankers and fled. And the flight itself was of total interest to our community, and to a degree it was our JFK murder. If you're from southwest Minnesota, one way to define it is simply say, do you know about the murder? And if you say, know about it, I locked my door for the first time in 40 years, then you're a southwest Minnesotan, or were. If I were here, I might say the artichokes sort of anticipated Enron, with much later, 2000, or Bernie Madoff. It deals with the conspiratorial as swindling, the secret, confidence games. The other hits you the way perhaps the Jacob Weathering crime might hit people in the St. Cloud region and then across the whole state, or more if you're, I don't know how many of you are Rochester natives, but Houston, a man called Houston Hansen, at the paper was nice enough to introduce me to your most overwhelming, in French they'd use the word bouleversant, crimes, the ones that tip your heart over or tip your mind over. And your David Broom case from 1988, which dealt with the axe murder of a mother, father, a sister, and a brother, too. That had to be overwhelming if you knew the Brooms, if you lived in this area. And so you'll know immediately how the artichoke crime played out in Marshall. If you don't get the point about big crimes in small towns, the point is very simple. Crimes, especially that are deep in human evil or deep in human cunning, really can hit small towns, really can hit them. And there's not much buffer around. And so towns, in many ways, get to know themselves and experience themselves by the clandestine. If I can read a quote, well, first let me say a few things about the clandestine. The clandestine is the haunted, it's the dead, it's the malicious souls, it's the darkest, it comes from the darkest and most threatening realms. It's about basements, attics, night, dark corners, secret alcoves, electric times. It titillates, seduces, beckons, beguiles. It makes our skin creep and can make our hair tingle. It also shapes our imagination. When somebody does, or some buddies do something hideous, we immediately wonder, could we do something that hideous? Could our neighbor do something that hideous? And it expands, for better or worse, our darker imagination, which all big crimes do. A lot of what is clandestine is about conspiring. and to teach you a little Latin tonight, which I don't know hardly at all myself. But conspire in Latin comes from spirare, which is to breathe, and conspire is to breathe with. And crimes that are clandestine are often crimes that involve people being nose to nose in planning to do the bad or doing the bad. It forces you to imagine what kind of human relations are there. Let me give you a few more words and I'll read you a quote. It's concealed, it's conspiratorial, it's covered, covert, disguised, furtive, secretive, shrouded, undercover, underground, under wraps. It's Kabbalistic, cryptic, esoteric, enigmatic, mysterious, occult, recondite, secretive. You learned I know how to use a dictionary and find synonyms. It's quite good. Now, the clandestine lurks below the surface of every face. Near to each hearth. It's in every imagined sexual transgression, whether it be suspected incest, an uncharged murder, an unacknowledged suicide, or far more commonly, surmised adultery. The clandestine can shadow everyday village life. For those of you who like to read about village life, you must read about the clandestine sides of village life. They all have a place that's a little out of the normal, a place that's a little threatening, and that they change over time. Willa Cather wrote, gossip in the village continually scans the world for trespasses. And the heart of another, to quote Midwestern writer Willa Cather, is a dark forest, always, no matter how close it has been to one's own. Save blessed trust, our fate is suspicion. It forms, as Dostoevsky would confirm, sinuous interior pathways and distinct local mental topographies. Crime creates a landscape, both a crime feared and a crime committed. Crime takes a hold of our attention. Goodness, Jeffrey Dahmer. Crimes occur, and they occur to these days where we have so much news with such hideous repetition but diversity. They literally steal our mind, sometimes for days. And I'm talking just in general in the nation. In March 2015, a German co-pilot flew roughly 150 people into a mountainside in the Swiss Alps. I couldn't get that out of my mind. I mean, not day and night, but it got in my mind like a burr under my mental saddle. You ever have a burr under your mental saddle? They hurt. And so I ended up writing a few lines of poetry. I've never finished this poem. This is about halfway through. It's called the part of this called The Devil in the Cap. This is called Act, meaning the part where the action begins. The co-pilot puts a yellow goggled helmet on his head of jumping lice and white maggots. It becomes his buzzing, putrid crown of angry bees, zigzagging bats, and hunting night-flying owls. How's that for Halloween? With brain knotted awhirl, neurons stitched together by white spider's black silk, he is wired with hate and aims to make his fiery crash global theater. He locks the captain out and flies his dark design. As his target approaches, he slightly accelerates fleeing the last gravity of grace and memory, even the hold of mother's bathing hands, anxious, gleeful, all that remains is clinching the ecstasy of a spiteful end. No call, no plea reaches him. Disdaining all voices and banging, he had locked himself in the cabin, if you recall. At the cabin door, he descends into the final shadow of alpine mountain and ravine. Singing, humming to self, he announces to all, I, the captain of spite, fly the downward course of black ire. So, you see, I got captured by him. I don't say I told you what's in his mind. But I do say I revealed to you the metaphors and images I was trying to use like a wrench to fit around what I thought was going on. Crimes, suspicion and crimes in small places are like salt and water. It just spreads. The molecules just diffuse very quickly in a very short time. And something that's really important does the same. In the modern countryside, sure, we don't have outlaws, brigands. There's not hobos under the trees. There's not werewolves. Oh, generally. I think there are a few on the outskirts of Rochester. I mean, at one time up in French Canada, they had werewolves all over, loup-garou. And we've kind of electrified the countryside and drove away the trolls, drove away the leprechauns. Said that for the Irish here. But that doesn't mean other breeds haven't come into our world. So places, have different types of clandestine figures, and they cause a different kind of clandestine imagination. Did you have a question back there? No? Okay. But the clandestine does fit with different times and eras. Talking about the whole nation in the 60s, and I use only the example of the Vietnam War. I don't start with the counterculture and the psychedelic stuff or the drug stuff. But the United States began to shake sort of with suspicion and fear to a degree, insofar as a big thing like a nation can shake. Even at our small college in Southwest, when Nixon crossed into Cambodia, students and some faculty shut the town Main Street down. The last time that had happened in Marshall was in 1932, when the farmers of the farm holiday movement, meaning a holiday on their payments, didn't want to pay the banks anymore and didn't want to lose their farms, so let's have a holiday. They shut down Marshall. About a month later, after I think another big action in Iowa, Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared the farm moratorium. This period was defeated in Vietnam, betrayed in the Near East. The nation was felt to be impotent abroad, a feeling that probably some of you share today. There's a sense that can't do much. Above all, which maybe some of you remember very clearly, the economy shook in this period. In the 70s, oil prices spiked in 1973 thanks to OPEC. On November 4th, 1979, adding further to Jimmy Carter's problem, Iranian radical Islamists, leftists, and students cast out our long-term ally, the Shah, and they literally took our people prisoners And we had over 100 students at our little college in Marshall who cheered for the action that the ambassadorial staff of the United States was taking captive. The captivity lasts 44 days, and every time somebody would go to give you the time of the year, well, this is the 420th day, this is da-da-da, and it paced out the nation like a pendulum, and it seemed to say our policies were wrong, America really wasn't an exceptional nation, it was rather weak and impotent. And the election of Reagan in '80 didn't really restore confidence to the shaken nation. Interest rates, and I won't go through all the interest rates, again went above 15%.
I'll never forget that.
Yeah, it's hard to. And you also come, what?
I made money. At one time I got 19% on the money.
Yeah, it's hard to forget that too. Under those Carter years, I think out in Marshall and I suppose across the nation, there were actually 21% or 20.5% was kind of the crest of that. Even with Reagan, the world wasn't particularly healed. He was no sooner in office, and aside from John Hinckley shooting him, banks again went sour, oil prices went up, and there were a tremendous number of bank failures in 1983. Bear that in mind, because 83 is the date of my two crimes. Tremendous number of bank failures across the nation. In 1983, 50 banks failed, easily beating the Great Depression record of 43 failures set in 1940. See, the times were shaking. There was a famous French thinker who said, you want to build, vous voulez bâtir, and the ground still trembles. Et le sol se tremble encore. Things were not settled. And on Main Street, farm assets depreciated over 50%, which meant if you wanted to get a mortgage on your tractor, your land values depreciated 50%, and corn prices flattened. Farmers, and if I use the word farmers, there was actually always 5 different types of farmers. Those that are rich and getting 20% on their money. Those who don't have to borrow too much money. Those who got to borrow quite a bit of money. Those that have borrowed all the money they can borrow, and those that are technically bankrupt. It's just a question when the moving van is coming to haul them away. But the nation was shook. Starting in late 77, there was a movement called AM, American Agricultural Movement. There were more radical things. How many of you remember what the militiamen were? A lot of the states had militias, and that meant extreme positions about, you're not going to take my land short of meeting my gun. Up in our Northland, the primary fellow that got the most attention, again in '83, was Gordon Call. Was a militiaman, had a shootout with the cops in which his son got injured. He fled and was found dead. But one of his words was, all power belongs to the sheriff. Now, let that digest in you for a second. The federal police come up and you say, all land belongs to the sheriff. Or all power belongs to the sheriff. The state police show up. I only worship the sheriff. The county police show up and you say, not you, sheriff, the real sheriff. So, I mean, it was a very jostling time. Elders were out. In our own area, there was all kinds of scams, little rackets and big rackets. West of us, someone sold mushrooms. You grow mushrooms at one price, buy them from us at one price, and guess what? We'll buy them back from you at another price someday, maybe. In Wisconsin, they fell in love with ginseng, a Chinese aphrodisiac. That's why Wisconsin's population went so high in '83. It was the time of ginseng. There was a lovely little town in Boyd, Minnesota. Boyd was failing like so many of our rural Minnesota towns. They needed an industry. So they tried to license themselves as the state's crematorium for amputated body parts. This was their new industry. It's not exactly something the Rochester Chamber of Commerce would like to hook to, I don't think. They didn't get it. But don't despair. Human beings rarely despair. They find it much easier to believe in nonsense. And as good fortune would have it, an English aristocrat came by who had the patrimony, the full patrimony of Charles II, the beheaded King of England. All he had to do was wait for the will to finally be settled. And if you invested in his new bank that he was going to build in Boyd, your children could all go to college for free if you owned a checkbook at the Bank of Boyd. Of course, it flopped. He drove away in a flurry of bad checks. One lawyer that was going to defend him lost her heart to him, and she continued to mourn the grievous loss long after the Englishman was caught and put in jail, probably only to get out to scam somebody else. This was an era of scam men, but Marshall, Minnesota wasn't going to be outdone. We were the home of the great, untold and retold Jerusalem artichoke circus. It was an agricultural scam. It occurred 18 months between 1981 to 1983. It was headquartered in Marshall, Minnesota, right in our hometown. In fact, its office was the former Gibson store that had kind of gone broke. And they produced the largest ag scam in American history that I was ever able to believe. Some have been very long-standing, like the promise we'll grow grapes in Minnesota, but after a while they came true. But the artichokes didn't come through. The American Farm Energy Service, that's what they call themselves, sold 25 to 30 million. No one's exactly sure. And I had 2 sets of the company's books in my records when I wrote the book. I got them from different sources. They sold roughly 25 to 30 million artichokes, dollars worth of artichokes, to approximately 25 growers across the upper Midwest and 3 Canadian provinces. Hey, you know what? I got to show a second slide. That's the cover of the book. This is the back cover of the book, and that's all praise and tells you about the crop, and there are copies back there if any of you want to just get a thumbnail sketch of what I said. This is the plant. This humble, indigenous sister of the sunflower, the Jerusalem artichoke. It's fundamentally, most of you'd call it a weed. but deer loved it. If you're really broke and you're running a hog operation, you might dice up the artichokes and feed them to your hogs. Or they might just grow too prolifically, which they did, cut down, and you leave them there. But this plant, a weed, propagates itself by the tubers. It's extremely potent in the way it grows, and it was sold as potentially, just around the corner, the new soybean. And it's the soybean that saved corn, as corn saved wheat. So we're dealing with big Midwestern botanical garden. This crop, and I am selling them after the talk. This crop, however, is providential, as it is the weed that's rejected by the farmer, like Christ is the stone that's rejected and becomes the new cornerstone. This will be the new cornerstone of American agriculture. Any of you jumping up and down? People did jump up and down. It was called a providential crop. A weed anointed a plant and then consecrated just as soon as tomorrow comes. A crop that'll save the American heartland. It's a Christ of crops. It's the stone, the weed, the builder rejected would be the cornerstone of a new rural and wholesome America. Hallelujah. Amen. Okay. These are 7 reasons why you should grow it. It's a fuel, and that was the main sale. This would pay the Arabs back. Once again, Henry Ford had somewhat the same visions. We would grow off the land the energy that would trump Rockefeller and the oil gang, and of course the OPEC people. So we're going to grow in our fields, with our fertility of our great soils, we were going to grow our own salvation. And there is truth that you can get alcohol, ethanol out of the artichoke, but you can out of a lot of other things too. Also, it's a high protein livestock crop. It's easy to grow. They wrote it's a double portion. You get the top and the bottom of it. The crop was fundamentally about its tubers, and the tubers they claimed are winter hardy. It was goodbye to expensive fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. Purchasers need to buy their seed tubers only once, and then after the crop, and after that the crop will supply, each year will supply its own seed because it propagates by tubers. In fact, it's a damn nuisance to get out of your land once you put it in there. What they didn't say, there was no coherent theoretical or field research on the plant. There were some older lingering hopes for it to go back to the 20s and 30s. There's a real history to hoping in the artichoke. But it was new. They didn't say they were still without a science to convert the plant, and they were without a full agronomy, meaning everything from the machines, the way to plant it, the way to harvest it, the way to store it, and it did bruise easily. It required specialized storage. There were no available machines, so they had to use old potato pickers. But more stunning, there was no market for it. And if there's nobody going to process it and there's nobody going to buy it, the providential plant might be put off for a while. Anyhow, the Come On ran something like this. If you buy 1,000 pounds of seed at $1.20, and we don't want you to buy more than 10 pounds because it'll produce 30 to 40,000 tons of artichoke. And we, the AEFS, will buy it back to you for 60 cents on a pound. So you will roughly make $400,000 on your 10 acres the first year, and we could all get together and change the math. And by the way, they did once in a while too. But this was going to save us from the Arabs and put us, the Midwest, the farmers, back in the driver's seat of history. Anybody saying this guy's giving the artichoke a bum rap and want to stand up for it? I mean, the dream has so much enthusiasm. I get talking about it and try to be comical, and then they're going to say, it's not fair, this is serious stuff. And anyhow, they had a first convention where they brought in all prospective buyers. It was based pretty much around the theme, if you have the grain of mustard seed in the New Testament, you can do what? Move a mountain, I recall. One of the guys at the first convention got all excited and jumped up and said, God, ignite my lips with artichokes. And I don't know how God would do that, but he was very enthused. And two of the keynote speakers were two women, middle-aged, and they both had come back from the dead to testify in favor of miracles in general, and by extrapolation, why not the artichoke too? The mechanism at work was 2,500 growers pumped in, let's say 10,000, just so you can do the math, and the owners did something exceptionally clever. I won't talk about all the ways they did it, but they really made Enron guys look a little clumsy. I'm sorry, you're from Texas, and but these guys, these Minnesota guys, and the one from South Dakota, and they were on the ball, and they would give all the services the company needed, including the buildings they were going to rent. They would sell them to the company and take the cash out. Then the cash that was still in there, they couldn't get their hands. I mean, they'd buy their own airplane, put a small down payment on it, and then charge the company every time the airplane flew over somewhere handsome. They did that with cars. But their favorite trick was they bought artichoke fields themselves and gave future stock, traded their future stock or their future income in artichokes for the cash that was in the company. So what the company ended up with is more artichokes. And need I tell you, the company went broke. I would like to, but I really want to keep time and not be unfair to you and go on too long. And I think Ann back there will start throwing rocks if I go on too long. Yeah, she's nodding, she will. So I'd like to depict the three principles in it. There's a malicious and delicious interlocking of religious faith, former alcoholism, survivalism, belief in the Green Revolution. It was, and that America was the home of one of the lost tribes of Israel. All of that compounded in the most fantastic stew that could have only been made in between, say, 1979 and 1983. You had a green revolution, you had high oil prices, you had TV evangelism getting on a big start at that point. And the two principles and then their main kind of business director, all had deeply evangelical backgrounds. And I'm not knocking evangelical religion, but like any religion, you can find extremes. And in this period, the extreme was, and it goes back to kind of a style, believe in miracles. And if you think you want a car, don't hesitate. Wish you're going to have a Cadillac or a Mercedes. I mean, if you're going to have a miracle, why deal with a Chevrolet? Okay. So those were the men, and I've skipped over them, and I'll just show you their faces. The two on the left, that's Dwyer, who was a construction agent, survivalist, and in the center, Fred Hendrickson, the man from South Dakota, the lawyer, the conservationist, and the daydreamer. And this other guy, Andy Van Zee, was one of those guys who got in on the ground floor and knew what was coming down, as far as I could tell, and he took advantage of it. The consequence of the fair, let's see what I got here now at the end. This is Mr. Challenge. He ended up actually creating the Challenge Home Series. That's L.D. Kramer. He's from I want to say Glenwood, Minnesota. Did tremendous good up there, but he also tended to do hustling. Anyhow, the Artichoke Company failed. It was several attorney generals' offices tracked it down, and finally they didn't have money. And it was always somewhat invisible in Marshall, because the sales they were making were quite far away. And both the humor of it and in the gravity of it didn't really register in Marshall. So in a certain way, even when it was found out, Marshall's honor wasn't stained, or the Chamber of Commerce could get on and say, we're the best little town on the prairie, or something like that. But the Artichoke did deal with conspiracies in a way. Who got the money? Where's the money left over? A favorite place was it's buried under the new runway at the airport. Some of the stories were immensely humorous. I preferred the scientist who tried to make malted milks out of it and got the worst case of flatulence he had ever had in his life. But more, I prefer the story of how they would fly, and literally, this is part of the record, they would fly people in from as far away as Texas that had a few prospective buyers of artichokes. And they would fly them over our fairly successful corn plant, which was making sugar, and claim that was theirs. But that was only half the trip. Just before leaving, they would feed them a favorite salad bar. And given the artichoke's potency to create gaseous situations, they would end up being jammed in a small plane and flown 8 hours back on their own fumes. Another favorite story of mine was I met the music store man. We'd bought a piano, I think, from him. And he'd given them an organ because they always started work out with a prayer and organ recitals. Or not organ recitals. Church music, hymns. But they weren't paying for the organ. So he had to get his organ back. He later did go, I think, broke. But he went and he told him he was going to repair the organ. But he said, I got to take it back to my shop. And he did it. There are all kinds of wonderful stories of a small town. But in the case of the artichoke thing, both in its performance and even its undoing, it it never quite got on the center stage, although if you were one of those people who likes to go to coffee clatches, do you use that word out here, clatches? What?
The women do.
Not the men? I think that's where all our superintendents of schools are, okay. Some of our superintendents of schools. No, coffee clatches, the artichoke was well known, and it would always, who bought them? Who lost money? Who used to work there? Who really believed them? One of their big salesmen, I'd love to tell a story about him, but he ended up in Broken Bow, Oklahoma. Just the name Broken Bow. Now, the other crime that I'm going to try to talk about in about 12 minutes is going to take even more jumping than the artichoke. I told you I'm trying to get 3 talks into one. This is what I call when father and son conspire. Our area was shaking. There were farm problems up and down the line, and particularly in the county adjacent to Lincoln County. Adjacent to Lyon County, where Marshall was, Lincoln County. There was lots of organizing going on. And all of a sudden on September 29th, and I say all of a sudden like a bolt of lightning, it was heard on the radio, a father and son killed 2 local bankers from the Ruthven State Bank. They disappeared in a white pickup. The sheriff in Lincoln County, located in Ivanhoe, received upwards of 10,000 sightings of a white pickup. But you could do that by driving around Rochester now. Everybody down here has a white pickup. And but for 3.5 days, no one knew what was going to happen. Bankers who dealt with that father and son fled, maybe to local motels or off to Sioux Falls to the motel. Some started to carry guns. But generally, doors got locked that hadn't been locked in about a 60-mile diameter from the murder, which occurred about 2 miles north of Ruthven, Minnesota. And maybe I should show you a slide. Is it time? Well, wait a second. Slide 1, yeah, why not? The crime, by the way, held our attention until they were discovered in Paducah, Texas. The son turned himself in to the police station there. He drove them out to where he said he last was with his father. His father was dead. There will be an issue of how he died or was killed. And then there'll be a trial. The trial will be taken on and tried by one of the state's bigger, he may be coming to speak here, right, Ann? Maybe? By one of the bigger lawyers in the state, Tom Fable, marvelous attorney, and was tried by what every county has, or several counties have, a local maverick attorney who's eccentric as the day is long, and we had that in the defense. The trial dragged on, led to the conviction of the boy. He ends up being adopted at the end of the trial by the attorney that I would say in many ways failed him, but that's an opinion. And at the same time, he had previously, when the son was out on bond, kept him at his house with his family in Granite Falls. So the crime was immensely local all this time, and even up to the final trial, it was on people's minds. Well, those are, I had transactions from the artichoke. This is the farm at which the murder occurred. There is the son and the lawyer, his lawyer. Stephen and Swen Anderson. There's the father, 46 years old, James Jenkins. There's the farm. One shooting occurred directly behind the farm. Some very good shots that went through one of the two bankers' neck. The second banker and the owner of the bank, who was quite an athlete, he was an old rugby player, took off running. He made it to the ditch and was brought down by 3 or 4 fairly well-shot bullets, and he was found dead in the ditch, and here they're hauling him out of the ditch. All that occurred on September 29th. This is the ambulance coming to pick the bodies up. Gives you some feeling for the murder. That little shed in the center is probably the shed from which the first shots that killed the first banker were fired. And what? This is 1983 again. This is an advertisement for 1983. On the surface, the crime itself had drama. 2 dead bankers, a long flight, a father found dead, and a student. But that's only part of the drama. There was something much more sieging about this story. This is the place where the father was found dead. Again, by the edge of the road. This whole story, in a way, takes place in a certain homeless way. The father is found dead with a handful of 22 bullets in his pocket, a ballpoint pen that he got at one of the places where he tried to get a loan and couldn't, and a few other objects. The murder scene is more complex. This scene is more complex. The Texas police decided that it was a suicide. The Minnesota police who came out, 18 hours flew over there, but they were 18 hours after and it rained. When they reconstructed the crime, they said, no, he did not kill himself. He was shot. Now that, if any of you have that kind of imagination, start to think about that. Who shot him? Why did he shoot him? And did he do it at his will or at the request of the father? And it opened up giant puzzles. On the very day of September 29th, they lured the bankers out to the farm where they used to live. The father was a failed farmer. Even the farm he was trying to run at that place I showed you before wasn't an operational farm. It was like a 20-cow dairy farm. It just wasn't working anymore, and he had farming techniques that were a loss. There was hardly anyone in the county who did business with that man that didn't end up, excuse the vulgarism, screwed. He was what they called then, I never used the word where I was from, but deadbeat. The father had come back after living pretty well homelessly, some of the time with the boy, who was 18 years old, working at carnivals, working kind of on yard work at a school. But he thought he had accumulated enough money to come back, but there was no place in southwest Minnesota that was going to let him start another farm. He did try to get a place going, but it didn't work. But they lured the bankers back by the father claiming he was a potential buyer of the farm. And when the 2 men got there, and the wife had just dropped one of the 2 off, and they're there, and she's going ahead for some other reason to town, and they're poking around, went in the house, and all of a sudden they unsprung the trap, or they caused the shooting, but they were shot. The crime, if I had a lot of time, I'd reconstruct it. It was very interesting and complex, but it boiled down to a simple thing. The son could run and shoot, and he'd been doing nothing since he'd been 16 for the last 2 years, but living alone with his guns, with his M1, and his practicing of shooting targets, which included some human figures and forms. He was a loner. He quit school, plenty bright, but he quit school. The son was living in a house where anybody would be filled with anger, and I jump way ahead, but the truth is, in that household, without blaming anyone, but in that household they'd all learned to lie to one another. The house crept with lies, deceit. They were bad for each other, and that includes the mother and father were bad for each other. But the father and son were really bad for each other. Because somehow or other, I'll jump ahead a little bit. This is the boy when he's up in Ivanhoe, but if you look at he's only 18, and this is before the age of some of the people we see, but look at the tattoos on the arm, the crew cut. When he first showed up at Paducah, they thought he was AWOL. This is the boy dressed up for court. Of course, you always want people who are accused to go in white. But those are the weapons. I don't know if any of you pay any attention to guns or weapons. But aside from being a riot shotgun, which the father gave him when he came back from Texas, and they started a search, which is not a good thing. A father who openly is telling people, my son is too hooked with guns, gave him that one. The father also signed for the M1. It was like a miniature M1, but it was the kid's gun. He slept with it. It was like his staff.
Where did he get it? That's an army gun. I had one when I was...
He got it somehow or other. It was like not a miniature, but a smaller M1, and somehow or other the father was able to sign for him, and he got it. And again, it was in Texas.
So the government might have told him that maybe they became obsolete.
I really don't know that story. What caught my side of it was the father signed for it, and then the kid, not by one testimony, but countless testimonies, kept the gun with him all the time.
And that was very deadly. The only thing is, it was heavy awkward to use.
This gun actually had a lot of malfunctioning, and part of the case would be, well, the shots were from the M1. The only one who could have shot that M1 without it jamming, these are testimony of experts, gun experts, was somebody who really knew it well. And by the way, the gun did jam even for the boy when he tried to shoot at a sheriff that was chasing them down around Laverne, Minnesota. The sheriff gave up the pursuit.
It was a good gun, but you had to keep it clean. It was somehow, I don't know why they used it. But anyhow, that's the old, but it was, if you could keep it clean, it was a deadly gun.
Right. And the gun that I'd call your attention to, and he had that gun from about the time he was 15, is a 410 shotgun. All of you know it's for small varmint. But he had clamped with a radiator pipe, radiator clamps, had clamped a bayonet on the end of his 410, and I think shortened the barrel. So the father was a deadbeat, had a terrible anger, was losing control of his life, felt when he gave up the farm and went through a divorce, he lost everything and was struggling somehow or other to get it back, but he thought he had cancer. He suffered hypochondria, and he was in very bad shape. The crime itself, some people wanted to make it a farm crime. There's a book, if you want to read the book that matches mine, but it's entirely opposite of mine, called The Final Harvest. The New York Times writer wrote the book as a farm story. I wrote it as a psychological story of a youth coming out of a broken home, anger, and then guns and militarization. So I'm going to just kind of jump right to the end. The trial went on. That's Fable. He did a much better job. They won. Oh, I'm going backwards? Okay, that's enough. Let me just complete the story saying the depth of the crime, for me, is hidden in the father-son relationship. The only thing, fathers and sons should not be that close together. And the only Greek myth we know, we may know others, but the main Greek myth we know, the father and son go into the minotaur, into the maze, and there's a minotaur in the maze. They escape with wax wings. Daedalus, the father, makes wax wings. And what happens to the son? He flies too close to the sun, the wax wings melt, and they go down. Fathers and sons aren't meant to conspire. The only thing they would have in common is to take back the wife, the mother, and put her back in the house. Well, the house is lost. The mother's gone off to live with somebody else. But the only thing they can generate any unity, I'm simplifying, but they do like to repair machines, and they're quite happy when they get a machine running. But aside from that, their communion is thinking about revenge. I'm not sure they went that day to shoot and kill the two bankers, but they set a trap for themselves, and they did kill the two bankers. The most puzzling question comes, did the son shoot the father at the end? And did the father, rather pathetic in many ways, ask the son to shoot him and claim, and then say to the son, be innocent. Put it all on me. So the father's last gift of apology to the son was, I'll take the crime on myself. You go and be free, which is really quite insane. If that construction of the crime is correct, he condemned the child to live without being able to make a confession of the truth. He eventually did make a confession. 2001 when he was up, or 2000 when he was up for parole, he finally said, I killed the two bankers. But he added very quickly, I didn't kill my father. They didn't say, why did you add that? We didn't even ask about it, but that's the way it went. So, 1983 created a world of the clandestine for us in southwestern Minnesota. We rode into a new clandestine in the saddle of the artichokes and in the much harder saddle of this father and son. It changed our view of what was going on in our countryside, who was out there, who the players were, what might happen next. And it took about, and this would be another talk, and I'm not going to start it, but I had about a 10-minute conclusion. I was going to go ahead and tell you about the types of crimes that started to erase in memory those crimes and define a new clandestine. But invite me again sometime and I'll give you talk too. Thank you. That's all I have to say. Yes.
Is the son back living with the attorney? He's out of prison now.
The attorney, Swen, died but 2 years later. And Swen had actually brought the son into his house. He himself had alcoholic problems, but his health went to hell. But what even compounded it is, he brought a third writer, call me one writer, called the guy from the New York Times, the second writer, or make him first, it doesn't really matter. But there was potentially a third writer, a teacher from Harvard who'd written a good book on the Pope's banker, Luigi D'Afonso, and he was working with Swen, which is quite a conflict of interest, to write a country story, a kind of a country, not a farm story necessarily, but a country story. So Swen was dead in '86. Stephen has just gotten out, and I don't follow this. I don't think it's my business. In many ways, I feel like I'm sticking my nose in other people's households when you write like this. This is not my favorite form of writing. It just happened. But Stephen is out about a year and a half now, after going up. They don't quite call it parole anymore, but before one of the boards, and I think he was up 2 or 3 times, and then they let him out. Yes, please?
What was the motivation for killing the 3 bankers?
The bankers, well, the older banker, Rudy Blythe, everyone hear his question? What is the motivation for killing? Rudy Blythe surely was the source of the bad credit reports when he came back the second time. Rudy Blythe was the banker that he gave the house over to, that bank. But he gave the house over short 30 cows that he'd put up in mortgage. But additionally, in their fantasizing, and this is what makes it so powerful studying like this, you're dealing just not with people's thoughts, not just what they do, but how they imagine the world. He had the mother at times sleeping with the banker. And then I didn't even raise the whole theater. On that day, they may have wanted to kill others. And if I'm giving you another talk, I would explain my information for that, who the others might have been, and what was in play. But that's a different, I mean, this stuff, when you pull on this stuff, there's lots of threads. and they begin to compel you. I know I got compelled around a simple thought. I loved my father. I hated my father. I'd do anything I could to please him. That kind of senseless but compulsive circle of human mind. Any other questions? Yes, please.
In 1982, I went out to Farm Fest.
Uh-huh.
They had representatives there from the Jerusalem Artichoke Company getting the farmers all enthused and everything. And there were a lot of the people who were, say, my father's age, who were standing there and it's like, this is a con, this is... And so is there a certain age range that was more easily convinced, or was it pretty much all over the board?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and that goes to the center of my book. We have wonderful Belgian farmers, the way there's wonderful Czech farmers, German farmers. You would never take them in. So that's one characterization. There's the people who were taken in actually weren't well rooted in community on the land or in farm on the land, and many were just on the edge of the agriculture. They weren't into agriculture. The second thing is, a lot of people who got into it, they're going broke anyhow, so let the banker pick up the money. But a good solid farmer, I don't think any of them lost their souls to it. And that explains partially why the crime didn't have much traction in the daily life of Minnesota, Marshall or thereabouts, because our farmers were pretty solid and pretty well off, whereas the farmers one county up, a little more on the ranching and credit side, and they were part of the AIM movement. And then when you go one county over, it's upland, it's onto the Buffalo Ridge, the soils are sandier, and the farms are more precarious, and that's where the larger organization of COAC and groups like that were going on. So you're quite right. The question is quite right to check who would buy those and who would buy that. The other thing is most of the buyers had a head start in miracle religion. You know, when people are desperate, this is an important point. It's painful, but when we're desperate, we usually think the next person through the door has the answer. We don't despair, say, well, it's desperate, I know about it. We say the next guy through the door is going to have the answer. I think there was that. So they were sold to desperate people. Does that help you? Yes, please?
Wasn't there also the influence of the posse comitatus? Because they were quite strong at that time, and I know particularly a little bit for 84, 85, and some of the bankers I knew, I was a pastor out in that part of Minnesota, and they carried guns because of the fear that was instilled by the posse comitatus, and this was one of the reasons.
Yeah, there were bankers shot. One banker shot in Iowa by a farmer, and that got a lot of attention to that. Some of the farm groups out our way said that when you mess with a farmer, he's going to get his deer rifle out. And that was a lovely story. Just like if the Wall Street's going broke, what will you see?
Jumping out windows.
Jumping out of the windows. So you mess with a farmer, they're going to be with their rifles. But indeed, there was that fear, and it was not just in our area, it was spread throughout the Midwest. So
That was a whole political movement.
as the whole political movement. And the posse comitatus, I think I may have confused when I went to militia. They were the ones with the last power goes to the sheriff. But the sheriff, it's a wonderful thought, because when you read old British common law, who was the most powerful guy? The sheriff, who was maybe the guy with the gun too. But it's just a wonderful story that way. But this is all before Constitution, before the United States, when you go for the sheriff. Oh, please, yes? I'm not hearing you.
Was there any large groups that bought into the artichoke out in the Rochester area? Or was it more southwest side?
I'm sure you might have had a few around here. I'd have to get through the list, which I don't have anymore. I gave them over to Michigan State. But I once had lists of all the buyers in the United States. You were destined to have a couple guys. Did you? Do you know of any around here? But I couldn't give you any names. But they would tend to be sort of concentrated. By the way, this is also the age when Amway begins to explode. And that's not accidental. It's in the same period. It's got the same notion. You buy the kit, you put in so much money. And it's a pyramid. And the Italians had that lovely guy in Boston back in the 20s who set the model for this, and it's called a Ponzi scheme. And it's very simple. Give me $1 and I'll give you $2 tomorrow. What a great deal. I go,
Tomorrow for me first.
yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, you run out of tomorrows is what happens with this scheme. And he did it, I think, for about 28 days, and he amassed all kinds of money. So if you all want to give me $1, is that it?
You won't be here tomorrow, though.
Well, you're catching on.
Depend on me every once in a while. You want to tell our door prize winner?
Oh, sure.
Right off the top.
Right, should I take your time or should I go down?
You already picked one.
Take one.
All right.
That's one. Say who it is.
All right, I'll say who it is. I think it's going to be funny if it's the one I filled. Oh, it's not. I thought it was crazy. Oh,
Who is it?
sorry. No, I thought it was going to be the one I filled out from before. Peroska Lucid?
Hey. And when on your way out, take one of the artichoke books with you too. It'll do you good.
So there you go. Thank you, everyone. Next week we'll have domestic violence. I know it's not true holiday, but it'll be an interesting program. So please vote.
Detroit person.
Wait, what?
She's Detroit, from Detroit.
Oh, what side? Oh, I'm an east sider.
We were married by Father Coughlin 50 years ago.
Oh, I know Father Coughlin's out in Royal Oak. I taught in Royal Oak for 2 years before I did college teaching. Yeah, the Shrine of the Little Flower. Wow, that Coughlin was...
Say, Joe, is Kay Hubble still around?
Kathy, we think so. You know, he's not always been in the best health, but Kay was around. We left Marshall about a year ago, and Kay was there.
Was he?
Was still living there and had a little Volkswagen he drove.
Oh, you know, and did you hear him tell
Holy jokes.
Holy and Lena's story?
I think I heard more than I cared to at times.
Yeah. See, he worked for the service cooperative out there,
Oh, did he? Yeah, that's right.
the Southwest Service Cooperative.